Well, welcome to a new Teen CGC 9.8 video. So today I wanted to recommend my 10 favorite Newsstand CGC 9.8 comic books that you can buy and hold forever. But really quick, just wanted to go over some of the basic differences between a Newsstand edition and a direct edition. Because, one of the big differences is sort of where they were distributed. So, direct editions basically went all directly to local comic shops. That's sort of where the name comes from. So if you bought a book at a local comic shop, a new book, it's probably going to be a direct edition for the most part. Whereas the Newsstand editions were distributed to like convenience stores and grocery stores and sort of like libraries like your Indigo, kind of on the magazine newsstands. One thing about the newsstands too that is generally sort of understood is that they're harder to find in the higher grade, and that's just kind of a common sense argument. Like, the direct editions are being handled by sort of comic shop owners that know the value of the book, whereas the newsstand versions are just kind of being thrown out by a stock boy or something like that, and are way less likely to be in really high-grade condition. That's sort of the argument. But speaking of rarity and everything and how they were distributed, that's going to depend on the year because, the distribution kind of changed with time. So I want to bring up a graph here. And this graph, what it shows is the distribution of a newsstand and directs, and then you have the years on the bottom. So what you'll notice is in 1986, it was about 50-50. So there were about 50-50 printed newsstand and directs. So, the newsstands weren't more rare than the directs or anything like that. And then after that point, leading into the late 80s and the 90s is when directs really started to increase the printing, an explosion in sort of local comic shops during that time. So the newsstands really start to become rare in sort of the late 80s and the early 90s. One thing to mention too on this, sort of pre-1986, the newsstands are actually less rare. But one thing to consider, though, is that sort of argument that I initially said, where the newsstands are much harder to find in the high grade because of how they were initially handled. So even though they're not as rare, sort of pre-1986 as the direct versions, I find newsstands still sometimes get a premium. And I think it's because of that reason that I initially said, where just a stock boy threw it up and wasn't paying attention to the condition or anything like that. So in CGC 9.8 comic books, even pre-1986, I find that newsstands can sometimes get a little bit of a premium over direct versions. But certainly after 1986 is where they really start to get a premium. And that's where we'll focus on my list here, is kind of, late 80s and early 90s books for the most part. So let's get into a full list here. Yeah, 10 Newsstand CGC 9.8 comic books to buy and hold forever. The first one is an Iron Man 282. Yeah, so first appearance of War Machine. This is one that or first full appearance of War Machine. This is one that I still have not picked up. And there's been a couple auctions through the last few years where I've just been outbid or something. Just didn't kind of happen for me with this issue yet. But I want to look on the census here and then do a bit of a calculation, and we'll get into that when we do. But there's 554 CGC 9.8s in the blue label for Iron Man 282. First full appearance of War Machine. Yeah, really great cover on this one. 40.8% is the CGC 9.8 ratio, so of all graded copies, 40.8% of them are CGC 9.8s. That's not really particularly rare for an early 90s book. We'll get into a couple others here that are more rare in the early 90s, so not too rare for this one. So that 554 number there of CGC 9.8s in the blue label. So if we sort of look at our chart that we looked at initially at the beginning of the video, I'm going to sort of say that for this Iron Man 282 is a 1992 book. I'm going to say about 12% of the distribution, just based on that chart, are newsstand versions. So if you take 554 CGC 9.8s, because the newsstands and the directs are all clumped in, so you take that 554 number and get 12% of that number. That gives you 66 newsstand 9.8s, because that 12% is sort of the distribution percentage of newsstands during this time. So you take 12% of the total 9.8s, you get 66 9.8s in the newsstand is sort of my rough calculation here. So to get a newsstand in Iron Man 282, it's kind of a 66, collector item, and that's kind of a rough calculation. Keep that in mind, not a definitive. So for Iron Man 282, the direct version it's about, 160, 170, 160, 170 US dollars in the CGC 9.8. Pretty tough to find some completed listings for these newsstand books. They're quite rare, so yeah, I didn't see any completed listings on eBay for Iron Man 282 newsstand. But with the direct going for about 160, 170, I think the newsstand version is going to be about $300 is a good deal. I could probably imagine people paying up to maybe $350 to $400 for this one in the newsstand. So yeah, price-wise with this video, because there wasn't very many completed listings for a lot of these newsstands, so I'll just kind of theorize of what I think a decent deal would be based on some of the distribution and what I've seen before. And some of the books, there are some completed listings that we'll get into for sure. But Iron Man 282 is an early 90s book, and I think it's a great one to get in the newsstand. And even for me with this book, there's been a couple directs where I just kind of never pulled the trigger or anything, but in the back of my mind I think, I'd really like to have a newsstand in Iron Man 282 because it is a 90s book, and 90s books are so well printed. So early 90s books I really kind of recommend to, maybe go after the newsstand because it makes sense in that era because they were such a low part of the distribution kind of thing. Yeah, that's when the newsstands really, weren't a big part of the distribution. So they're more rare in the early 90s book. So Iron Man 282 is definitely a newsstand candidate. Next book here is a Silver Surfer 44. Yeah, this one is pretty rare in the newsstand version. Yeah, so let's just look on the census here for the directs and the newsstands all clumped together. 262 CGC 9.8s in the blue label. 23.7% is the CGC 9.8 ratio. So not bad, 9.8 rarity on this one. 23.7% of all graded copies are CGC 9.8s. That's, a better rarity than the Iron Man 282. So Silver Surfer 44 with 262 9.8s on the census in the blue label. It's about the same era as Iron Man 282, so I'm going to take about 12%, which is kind of my rough estimate of the newsstand distribution at that time. So if you take 12% of 262 total 9.8s, that's 31 9.8s in CGC 9.8s in the newsstand version for a Silver Surfer 44. Was looking at trying to look at a couple completed listings, and I didn't really see any on eBay, but there is a 9.6 newsstand on eBay, and I believe they're asking like $450 or best offer or something like that. It might even be higher than that. That's a 9.6, and yeah, given that, there's only 262 9.8s of this book out there, that's not too much for an early 90s book. But then you do that 12% calculation, which is about the distribution of newsstands at that time, and that's giving you 31 Silver Surfer 44s in the newsstand at 9.8. Because, this book is, I think, a really good deal in the direct version, is about $170, let's say. And I have two of these in the direct. Yeah, one of my, first appearance of the Infinity Gauntlet, too. But with the directs going for about $170 right now, and this one, there only being about 31 of them in the newsstand 9.8. I think this one is going to be around that $500 in the CGC 9.8 newsstand version of a Silver Surfer 44. And this is a book that really stood out to me. It's a book I really love, and because I actually am really thinking of hunting for this one in the newsstand, just because it's a book I really like. The cover, first appearance of the Infinity Gauntlet, which I think is kind of underappreciated at this time. So I think this is a really good one to go after in the newsstand, but there's only about 31 of them out there, and it's going to be, my theory on this price is that it's probably about 3 or 4 times more than the $170 direct version, certainly based on that 9.6 newsstand where someone's trying to get like $400 or $500 for the 9.6. So a really rare one in the CGC 9.8, but Silver Surfer 44 newsstand is one to hunt for, I think. It's one of the better ones from the early 90s to hunt for in the newsstand. So next book is a huge book. Yeah, New Mutants 98. Yeah, a really great one to look for in the newsstand. Similar to the first two books, early 90s book. So comics so well printed in the early 90s books. Comic shops exploding during this time, so a ton of direct editions. So you get a newsstand, New Mutants 98, a little more rare, and yeah, one I'd recommend. On the census, 3,204 CGC 9.8s in the blue label, so a lot of them for a really popular character like Deadpool. 20.2% is the CGC 9.8 ratio, so of all graded copies, 20.2% of them are CGC 9.8s. That's not too bad of a rarity at all for an early 90s book. It's, getting into like pretty rare for an early 90s book, to be honest. 20.2% of all graded copies are CGC 9.8s. So, an early 90s book as well, so I'm going to use that same about 12% calculation. So if you take that 3,204, 12% of that is 384 newsstand CGC 9.8s in the New Mutants 98. So sort of one of 384. And for this one, I think the newsstand prices are a little more reasonable because I think there are quite a few more newsstands, just being that there's a lot of 9.8s in this book as well. So I would say right now the direct version for New Mutants 98, going for about $750 is a good price for that right now. So, and newsstand versions, a lot of the completed listings that I'm seeing, because I, did see quite a few completed listings for the newsstand in the New Mutants 98 because it's such a popular book. Right around $900. Even one I think went up to $1,000. Sort of in this hot environment, this book's heating up a little bit too, along with almost every CGC 9.8. But a direct at $750 with the newsstand at around $900. That's not too bad. Again, this one, there are quite a few more newsstands out there because it's such a popular book in the CGC 9.8. But, this is one that it's not too much more expensive to get the newsstand. And I've recommended, if people feel like, they want to get into the newsstand hunting, this is a really good one to buy in the newsstand because it's not that much more expensive than the direct, but it still is a more rare newsstand. So, New Mutants 98 with probably only about 384 CGC 9.8s in the newsstand out there. So, it's definitely one to go after in the more rare newsstand. New Mutants 98, first appearance of Deadpool. Next one is a huge book, too, and one that's an awesome newsstand one to consider. Batman Adventures 12, first appearance of Harley Quinn in comic books. And Batman Adventures 12 is a little bit later into the not too much later, but kind of in the mid-90s, a 1994 book. So Batman Adventures 12, as you sort of get later on into the 90s, the newsstands become more and more rare. So we'll look at the sort of newsstand calculation in a sec, but there's 853 CGC 9.8s in the blue label. So not too many of these in the blue label, even as is, both directs and newsstands. 14.9% is the CGC 9.8 ratio. So of all graded copies, 14.9% of them are 9.8s. So that's nice and low and rare. This is a really expensive book because of that rarity in the CGC 9.8 for a 90s book. That's pretty much class-leading rarity in a really big key issue with a big first appearance in the 90s. 14.9% CGC 9.8 ratio. So, for Batman Adventures 12, instead of using 12%, which is kind of my early 90s newsstand distribution, I'll use 10% for this one. So, even a little bit lower, even more rare as you get later into the 90s, this one being a mid-90s book. So, 10% of 853 is about 85 CGC 9.8s in the newsstand of Batman Adventures 12. So, we had someone on the team here. I think it was Roman. I talk to Roman quite often on Instagram, and he had purchased a Batman Adventures 12 newsstand for right around $2,000, and I think it might have been a little bit over, but I thought that was a really great buy. And this is when I had sort of made that Batman Adventures 12 video saying that it was a good time to buy, and at that point, like the direct versions in the 9.8 were kind of pulling back in price to around like $1,400 ish. I think one had went for like $1,350. That was like the lowest I had ever saw. And so I made that video saying to buy the direct for around that price. And Roman had sort of went out there and bought the newsstand around that time, and it was right around $2,000. I thought that was a great deal. And I think that is sort of the price range you're looking for now. For a newsstand, it's a one of 85 collector item, this book in the newsstand. I think it's totally worth that sort of a little bit over $2,000 if you can get this book in the newsstand for about that price. I think 15, 20 years down the line, that book's going to be worth way more than $2,000. And I could imagine it maybe in the newsstand version, maybe even you know, 10, 20 years down the line, maybe being about $10,000 even, just given that, yeah, it's a 1 of 85 collector item. A lot of people love collecting the newsstands from this era too, so I could see how Batman Adventures 12 is just a great book, to a great investment grade book to grab in the newsstand. And yeah, a pretty rare book too. Yeah, a 1 of 80. It's rare as it is in the CGC 9.8, but when you kind of do that newsstand calculation, a 1 of 85 collector item is just really cool. And I think that's a great investment grade book. Yeah, Batman Adventures 12 in the newsstand, CGC 9.8. So next one is certainly one I've considered buying in the past, and I've actually saw a couple of them, whereas some of these you just don't even see them very often sell because they're so rare. But an Incredible Hulk 340. Yeah, so Todd McFarlane cover, classic Wolverine versus Hulk battle, second time they ever fought. So in the blue label, in the sort of direct and newsstands all clumped in together on the census, 709 CGC 9.8. And the 9.8 ratio is 13.8%. So we're getting into the 80s here, late 80s. So a little bit lower on the 9.8 ratio. 13.8% of all graded copies are CGC 9.8. That's nice and rare for a late 80s book. Yeah, Incredible Hulk 340 is just looking really solid on the census. So for a late 80s book, I'm going to use a bit of a higher percentage to sort of guesstimate or calculate how many newsstand 9.8s there are. So yeah, in the early 90s, I was using like 12% and 10% even for Batman Adventures 12. But for Incredible Hulk 340, I'll use 20%, just kind of based on that chart we looked at. So if you do 20% of the 709 CGC 9.8s, that's going to give you 141 approximately newsstand versions of Hulk 340 CGC 9.8. So, you know, only about 141 out there in the newsstand. And I maybe saw like 2 of these sell in like an auction throughout my years, kind of 2-3 years here of collecting CGC 9.8 comic books. Yeah, you know, a normal Incredible Hulk 340 direct, I have 4 of them, I guess, in CGC 9.8. You know, that's sort of right now going for about $500. You know, some have been selling for $600. I bought all mine for $400, but the market has kind of heated up. I think they're about $500 to $550 now. So I had saw a couple newsstand versions in this before the market had really heated up here in the last 6 months. Sell for about like $800, let's just call it. Yeah, right around about $800 US. Now I think it'd probably be pretty tough to get this one under $1,000 in the newsstand. Yeah, I have a feeling that it you know, if one kind of popped up for about, you know, $1,050 in a buy it now or something, I think that would be bought pretty fast. Just with how the market has heated up with this book a little bit. But yeah, that's sort of my guesstimate for now, the price of a Hulk 340 CGC 9.8 newsstand. Hopefully less than $1,000, but I think it's going to be right around that $1,000, with the direct being about $500, $550. Hopefully it's not more than that too. You never know. But Incredible Hulk 340 is a late 80s book, a 1988 book, so it's getting right into that era of where newsstands started to get really rare. So yeah, Incredible Hulk 340 is one to consider in the newsstand, CGC 9.8 for sure. So next one is an Amazing Spider-Man 300. Yeah, so I brought out my Amazing Spider-Man 300 CGC 9.8. Got a direct version of it. I got another direct version in the 9.8 in an old case as well. But also got in the raw 2 newsstand versions. So yeah, let's look on the census though for Amazing Spider-Man 300. There's a 1,016 CGC 9.8s in the blue label. The 9.8 ratio is 5.7%. So yeah, this is why this book is so special. Of all graded copies, only 5.7% of them are CGC 9.8s. And, you know, that's why I have 2 of them, and that's why I've sort of recommended this book as, like, the 180s book that you could sort of, you know, it's like, attainable, but it's still super rare. You know, certainly there's, like, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 first print is, like, really rare, too, for the 80s, but it's almost unattainable, certainly in the 9.8. So this is a book that just stands out in the direct, and that's, you know, why I have 2. But if we take that, about 20%, of all the, you know, copies are going to be newsstand during this era about. So that 1,016 9.8s, 20% of that is 203 CGC 9.8s in the newsstand, and Amazing Spider-Man 300 is about the sort of guesstimate for how many there are out there. So a 1 of 203 collector item. So what's really good about this one is I just saw a completed listing on this in the last few days here, and we documented it on our pricing video that we did yesterday. But one had sold for $4,500. Yeah. So like my direct 9.8s, like this one right here, I bought for $1,975, I think it was, and with shipping it was like about $2,000. With the newsstand going for $4,500, that's quite a markup. But you know, this is one of the biggest 80s key issues, origin and first appearance of Venom. It already is really rare in the direct or the newsstand in the high grade 9.8. So to make it even more rare and get the newsstand, I can kind of understand that $4,500 price. It's just so rare and such a huge book of the 80s. So yeah, I mean, if it's in your budget and you're a big newsstand hunter, this is one to consider. And I even said on our pricing video, like, if I had saw that auction of the newsstand Amazing Spider-Man 300 CGC 9.8, I would have been really tempted, even around $4,500, to purchase that one. So yeah, Amazing Spider-Man 300 is one to consider in the newsstand 9.8, absolutely, if it matches your budget. Next one is a Spawn number 1. Yeah, so Spawn number 1's interesting because it's an Image comic, so a little bit different than sort of Marvel and DC, and we'll get into some of the newsstand distribution for Image comics in a second here. But for Spawn number 1, there's 5,694 CGC 9.8s out there, so a ton of 9.8s out there, and usually the direct version of a Spawn number 1 goes for about $100 in the CGC 9.8, because there's so many of them, it's not really rare. The 9.8 ratio is 52.5%, so nothing to kind of write home about there. But when you take that 5,694, and what I'm going to do with the Image comics is, Image did not have the sort of newsstand distribution sort of logistics system that Marvel and DC had. So they have, I think, a lot less of their copies were newsstand initially when they were printed. So what I'm going to do with this one is take 5% of that 5,694 9.8s, which is lower than what I would sort of do for an equivalent Marvel or DC book of this era. But 5% of that 5,694 is 284. So Spawn number 1 newsstand, I think there's about 284 of them out there. I think is a, you know, kind of a conservative estimate, certainly an estimate. But that's pretty good for Spawn number 1 newsstand. This is one I have in the CGC 9.8 as well. I'll probably put a graphics up for all of them. I didn't bring them out today, but yeah, 1 of 284 in the Spawn number 1. This is one that, you know, I think I would really recommend, and we'll get into sort of our top picks, but given the Image sort of newsstand distribution was so rare and low, and, you know, Spawn being a great first appearance character to get, and with the directs there being so many, this is one where I think it really is, like, you want to sort of recommend, I would recommend to get the newsstand version, and probably not even buy the direct version, to be honest. And yeah, Spawn number 1 newsstand is, I had purchased mine, it was like maybe 8 months ago, maybe even a year ago now, for $375 plus like $20 shipping in Canada. Yeah, I remember I just got it for a lick under $400. And that took me a while to sort of get. Like, this is one that, for, you know, in the past 2-3 years here, like, I saw quite a few sell for like $469.99 and, you know, $449.99. That was sort of normal to see this sell, but a good fair market value was right around $400, maybe a little under. So I got a pretty good deal on that. I think now, yeah, it's going to be that sort of $450 to $500 area for a Spawn number 1 newsstand. Maybe closer to $400 if you get lucky. But I think it's totally worth it. Yeah, you get a big first appearance of Spawn in the more rare newsstand version. So yeah, Spawn number 1 really sticks out as one to sort of not even look at the direct in the 9.8 and just get the newsstand, because it's still somewhat affordable at around that, you know, $450 area, we'll call it. So next one is an Amazing Spider-Man 361. Yeah, first full appearance of Carnage. Kind of an early 90s book, really popular early 90s book. Love this cover, probably my favorite 90s cover, I think. So on the census for first full appearance of Carnage, 3,679 of them in the CGC 9.8 blue label. 9.8 ratio, 26.6% of all graded copies are CGC 9.8. So kind of a bang on average, like, you know, it's not rare, but it's not like super rare or anything like that. So there's a lot of them here, 3,679. For a book this in this era, sort of early 90s, I took 12%. So 12% of that 3,679 is 441. So I think that's a good guesstimate of how many Amazing Spider-Man 361's first full appearance of Carnage there are in the newsstand, CGC 9.8, about 441 of them. And yeah, this one is a good one to get because it's a pretty similar price to the directs, just maybe about a 20 or 30% premium. So the direct versions right now, they've been sort of heating up because of the Let There Be Carnage Venom 2 sort of announcement happened, and these are going for a little bit more than what I'm used to. But I think a direct version right now is about $425 to $450. So for newsstand right now, I think a decent deal is right in that $500 area. Yeah, they're not too much more expensive than their directs. And I think because of that too, this is another one I would really recommend to, you know, I have a direct and a newsstand in this one, in the CGC 9.8, and this is one you could really just go after the newsstand if you want as well. Totally up to you, but yeah, just, you know, let's call it $75 more for the newsstand, which is quite a lot more rare. About only 441 of them out there, rather than over 3,000 of the sort of directs. So I think for Amazing Spider-Man 361, it kind of does pay to get the newsstand in this one. Similar story to a New Mutants 98, I think. Both really popular books. So the next book is definitely a popular one for newsstand hunters, I think. So I wanted to include it. An Amazing Spider-Man 316. Yeah, classic McFarlane Venom cover. The kind of first cool McFarlane Venom cover. So on the census for this one, 919 CGC 9.8s in the blue label, and 28.2% is the CGC 9.8 ratio. So of all graded copies, 28.2% of them are 9.8s. And that's, yeah, again, not really rare at all, but like, you know, not super not rare. It's kind of right in the middle there, kind of bang on average in rarity. Nothing to really write home about though. But this being a late 80s book, a little more newsstands sort of circulating in distribution at this time, so I took 20% was my sort of guesstimate of the 919 CGC 9.8. So 20% of that 919 is 183 newsstand CGC 9.8s in an Amazing Spider-Man 316. So for price for this one, you know, pretty hefty price premium for this one. Yeah, like I said, I think this one is, for some reason, quite popular with the newsstand hunters. So a direct version is, I think, going to be about $300. I've saw a few here go over 300 lately, which is kind of a sign of the moment where this 9.8 market is just really hot. But I had purchased mine about 6 months ago for like $260 something. So yeah, and I think an auction ended the other day and it was like $350. So this one's heating up as well. But for the newsstand, I think a decent price. I've heard people getting it for $500, but I think that's probably going to be a little bit too low now in this environment. I think right now a decent fair value for the newsstand is going to be just bumping up to $600 right now. Yeah, maybe if you're lucky, closer to $550. But yeah, Amazing Spider-Man 316 is a really popular book. It seems to be popular with the newsstand hunters, and yeah, I've heard people in the last 2 years getting it for about $500, but I think now the market has moved on a little bit and probably closer to $600 for an Amazing Spider-Man 316 newsstand CGC 9.8. Yeah, one to consider for sure. All right, last one on the list, number 10 here, an Uncanny X-Men 266. Yeah, first full appearance of Gambit. This is a great one to consider in the newsstand for sure. Yeah, looking on the census for this one, in both the newsstand and directs, there's 2,570 CGC 9.8s in the blue label right now. So quite a lot of them out there for a really popular character. You kind of expect that. 9.8 ratio, 20.9% of all graded copies are CGC 9.8. So yeah, that's getting into pretty rare territory for an early 90s book. Very similar looking to New Mutants 98 on the census. They're really almost identical on the census, New Mutants 98 and Uncanny X-Men 266. So when you take that 2,570 number and you take 12% of that, which is normal for kind of the distribution for newsstands in the early 90s, you get 308 of Uncanny X-Men 266s in the newsstand. So one of 308 collector item for kind of a rare first full appearance of Gambit book, I think is a really cool book to consider. And yeah, this is one of the more rarer ones too, from the early 90s as well already. You know, not including just the newsstands with the direct and the newsstand. So to make it even more rare with the newsstand version kind of makes sense too, in my opinion. So about 308 though, we'll call it for X-Men 266 in the newsstand. First full appearance of Gambit. Price for this one. This one is really heating up in both the direct and the newsstand since, you know, X-Men's coming back to the MCU. So like Gambit, first Rogue, first Mr. Sinister, like they're all, first Jubilee, they're all really heating up. So I think for a direct version, we had documented on our price video, like I think one went for like $460 and another one went for like, I don't know, it was like $480 maybe. So they're sort of getting up to that 500 range, sort of 450 to 500 in the direct. Yeah, a newsstand did sell on eBay, and I believe it was $650. I'm just realizing I didn't write that down. But I think they're right around that sort of $650. You know, maybe if you really want it and it looks like a great newsstand, looking awesome in the 9.8, maybe $700. And yeah, I think, you know, with this one being an early 90s book, you know, the newsstands kind of make sense, it being a little more rare. Yeah, this is definitely one to consider. And, you know, it is pretty heating up compared to some of the prices I'm used to in the last year or two here for this book. But, yeah, if Gambit comes on the MCU, I could see this even heating up even more. And, yeah, considering it looks exactly like New Mutants 98 on the census, and New Mutants 98 being a little bit more money, you know, maybe you could say this is undervalued too, but definitely one to consider, though, in the newsstand. Uncanny X-Men 266, first full appearance of Gambit. Okay, that's the full 10 we get through. Now, we'll go through top picks, but, you know, to be honest, like, all of these are really great investment-grade books. You have to be really patient on these, because they're the newsstand, the more rare newsstand versions, so if you can get your hands on any of these, I think they're all real great investment-grade books. I've mentioned a lot, like, I don't even see a lot of completed listings for a lot of these, just shows how rare they are. But, so they're all really have their own merit, these books in the newsstand. But I did kind of try to get 3 top picks here. So first top pick, Amazing Spider-Man 300. Yeah, in the newsstand. I know it's really expensive, but it's just a one-off special book that's extremely rare in the 9.8 with that super low 5.7% CGC 9.8 ratio. But then you get the sort of cover that's been homaged a gazillion times, which I think matters, and just sort of the sort of longevity of this cover and the sort of iconicism of the cover. I think it's super iconic. You got the Todd McFarlane cult of fans, and then if you throw in that super newsstand rarity in this one, it is really expensive, $4,500. But yeah, if you're sort of really serious about your 80s investment grade books, I think that $4,500 is going to look really good in 20 years. Like, I could totally see this book in 20 years being well over $10,000 in the newsstand CGC 9.8 for Amazing Spider-Man 300. So that's my kind of top pick for a serious investment grade book. Batman Adventures 12 is my second pick, and similar reasoning to Amazing Spider-Man 300. For a 90s book, this is like pretty much leads the pack in 90s rarity for a big key issue. Batman Adventures 12. So when you add the newsstand, it makes it even more rare. And I think over time, that is really going to be, you know, this is really going to be a good book to get in the newsstand version. Yeah, so Batman Adventures 12, although expensive, yeah, I'm guessing they're over $2,000 certainly in this environment right now. Batman Adventures 12 in the newsstand, CGC 9.8. But again, as I said earlier, I think that's one that could be over 10 grand in 20 years if you got a long-term time horizon. Third one was kind of hard to choose, top 3 picks, but like I said, you can always pick any of them. But Spawn number 1. I think Spawn number 1, given that Image really did not have the sort of the newsstand logistics kind of distribution setup that Marvel and DC had, so hardly no newsstands printed among Image comics. So it makes them a little more rare. Spawn number 1 being such a cool hero, I love Spawn, and you know, I do recommend to kind of get his first appearance. And there's so many directs. Spawn was so popular in the early 90s that I think the newsstand is the one to get in for Spawn number 1. I think, like, tied with my third pick, I think is the Uncanny X-Men 266. Yeah, and maybe even New Mutants 98, kind of all tied for the third, I guess, because, yeah, and I think a lot of these books have merit in the newsstand because, yeah, they're just really rare collector items, which is great from when you're thinking about it from an investment perspective, for sure. Okay, so concluding up here, I think, you know, newsstand collecting, I think, is an incredible niche. It's a great niche to sort of collect in. Personally for me, I've sort of not really went out of my way to sort of hunt newsstands because I'm really happy with getting a direct version for a little bit less money and sort of having great pride of ownership from the direct as well for a little bit less money again. So that's sort of my thinking. But I do have some newsstands, and I've sort of been opportunistic, I think, on newsstands. Like when I see one and, oh, decent price, and, that makes sense, then I'll buy it. But I'm not really, like, searching out newsstands. However, I think, if you are sort of a niche collector in the newsstand, sort of after 1986, which is where they get really popular, and, take a look at that graph that we looked at again earlier, if you want to kind of double take that one to see some of the details on the rarity. But I think newsstand sort of niche collecting after 1986 is a really cool thing to consider. I don't think it's 100% for me personally, but if it's in your budget and you really like late 80s and 90s books, this could be right up your alley. And it actually is something that I would recommend, although maybe not 100% for me, as I said. But yeah, newsstand niche collecting after 1986, I think is something to consider. So yeah, hopefully this list of 10 here got you off on a good start there, give you some ideas, and you kind of, the main books here. But I mean, if you're just starting out collecting, these are the books you really want to think about from the late 80s and the 90s, because they're all the big key issues that, should do very well over time if you're just patient and you don't kind of panic sell or anything like that. Okay, well, that'll be all for today's video, and if you haven't already, I'd invite you to join the team and subscribe to Team CGC 9.8. Yeah, I would love to have you on our comic book collecting and comic book investing team. Hit the bell for all the latest notifications. Add me on Instagram and Twitter too as well. I'll have all the links in the description below. I'll put a list in the description below with some of the information that we talked about. Just that sort of newsstand calculation. I'll put that in the description below as well, just to kind of have a bit of a cheat sheet. But yeah, you know what? Newsstand, CGC 9.8 comic books. I could see myself maybe getting into them a little bit more, although I don't think I'm ever going to kind of specifically hunt for only newsstands. But it is worth knowing. It's, worth getting all this information for sure, I think. And, if you're into just more rarity and those, and you have the budget for it, I think, yeah, the newsstand CGC 9.8s from this era could be something to consider for sure. Alright, thanks so much for watching today. Yeah, I really appreciate all the support. Message me on Instagram if you did have anything to talk about. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me is on Instagram there. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.